In November 1943, the United States opened a new phase of the Pacific War. The target was small, the battle was short, but the cost was shocking. On a strip of coral and sand called Batio in the Tarawa Atoll, thousands of men fought and died in only 76 hours. On a map, it barely seemed large enough to justify the scale of the invasion assembled against it. In battle, it became one of the clearest demonstrations of what it would actually take to break through Japan's island defenses across the Pacific. To American planners, Tarawa was an important step in the Central Pacific Drive. To the Marines who approached it in landing craft, it became something more personal and far more terrible. It became a place where the theory of amphibious warfare collided with coral reefs, fortified seawalls, machine gun fire, low tides, and the kind of concentrated killing power that could tear assault waves apart before they ever reached dry sand. Tarawa was not a long campaign like Guadalcanal. It was not a dramatic naval turning point like Midway. It was a compressed battle, a brutal test case, a warning written in smoke, surf, and blood. The United States would win at Tarawa, but the victory came at such a visible cost that it stunned Americans at home and forced the military to rethink the way it would fight its way across the Central Pacific. This is the story of Tarawa, the 76 hours that taught America how expensive invasion would be. By late 1943, the Pacific War had entered a new stage. The United States had survived Pearl Harbor. It had stopped Japan's momentum at Midway. It had endured the long grind of Guadalcanal and begun pushing back. But victory in the Pacific could not be achieved by isolated defensive successes alone. The war now required movement, island by island, base by base, airfield by airfield. That was the logic behind the Central Pacific Offensive. American planners intended to strike selected targets, seize them, build airfields and naval positions, and use them as stepping stones toward the Japanese inner defensive line. This was not a campaign of conquering every island. It was a campaign of choosing the islands that mattered most. The Gilbert Islands were the next major objective. Within them, Tarawa stood out. Batio, the main island in Tarawa Atoll, was tiny in physical size, but important in strategic position. Capturing it would help open the way toward the Marshall Islands and farther west. It would also test whether the United States could successfully seize a heavily defended coral atoll in the face of determined Japanese resistance. So Tarawa was not just another landing. It was an experiment under live fire. It would help answer a question central to the rest of the Pacific War. Could the United States break into Japan's outer defenses through direct amphibious assault? That is why Tarawa mattered. It was tactical, strategic, and educational at the same time. Success would open doors. Failure would force delays, revisions, and doubt. And because Tarawa sat at the beginning of a larger road, every mistake made there would echo forward into the next invasions. The Americans were not attacking an empty beach. They were attacking a fortress. Batio was only about 2 miles long and a few hundred yards wide in many places, but the Japanese had packed it with defenses. They had transformed the island from a coral outpost into a killing ground designed to break an amphibious assault before it could organize itself. There were strong points built from reinforced coconut logs, concrete, coral, and sand. There were trenches, covered routes, firing pits, anti-boat guns, anti-aircraft guns, heavy machine guns, barbed wire, mines, and bunkers positioned to overlap fields of fire. The island had not merely been garrisoned, it had been prepared. The defenders' goal was simple: force the Americans to fight their way across narrow beaches under concentrated fire, then destroy them before they could break inland. The terrain itself helped this plan. Coral reefs lay in front of the island, and behind the beaches stood seawalls and fortified positions. This meant that the attack was dangerous at every stage. First came the problem of reaching shore. Then came the problem of surviving on the beach. Then came the problem of breaking through defenses that had been built precisely for this kind of assault. The Japanese commander, Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki, had reason to feel confident. Whether every dramatic quote later attributed to him was exact or not, the spirit behind them fit the island's defenses. Batio was built to make an attacker bleed, and unlike on larger islands, there was very little room to escape the battle. Tarawa compressed violence into a tiny space. Once the assault began, there would be almost no distance between lagoon, beach, bunker, trench, and airstrip. The whole island would become... The attack opened on November 20th, 1943. American warships and aircraft hit Batio with a heavy pre-invasion bombardment. Battleships fired from offshore. Carrier aircraft struck the island. Cruisers and destroyers joined in. To many on the American side, the amount of firepower seemed overwhelming. It was easy to believe that no defender could survive under that kind of pounding. That belief did not last long. The bombardment damaged Batio, but it did not erase it. Many Japanese positions survived. Some were shattered, many were stunned, enough remained ready to fire. Even before the first wave reached the shore, other problems began appearing. The assault timetable slipped. Sea conditions complicated the movement of men from transports to landing craft. Coordination, always difficult in amphibious operations, became harder under real battlefield pressure. Then came the problem that would define the landing. The tide was lower than expected. Some of the tracked amphibious tractors, the LVTs, could crawl over the coral reef. But many of the later waves came in ordinary landing craft that could not cross the reef once the water proved too shallow. They grounded far from the beach. That changed the assault from a hard landing into a nightmare. Marines had to climb out into the lagoon, often in chest-deep water, holding rifles, radios, ammunition, explosives, and other gear above their heads while trying to move toward shore. They were no longer advancing as planned. They were wading into a firing range, and the Japanese were ready. This was the moment Tarawa became legendary. The Marines were exposed in open water with little cover and little ability to maneuver. Japanese machine guns opened up from protected positions. Rifles cracked from bunkers and firing pits. Mortars and artillery struck the lagoon, the beach, and the approaches. Men fell long before they reached dry ground. Some drowned after being wounded. Some were dragged down by heavy gear. Some disappeared beneath the surface among splashes, blood, and shattered coral. Others kept moving because there was no alternative. The beach was ahead. Death was everywhere else. Those who reached the shoreline found almost no safety. The seawall, shell holes, wrecked vehicles, corpses, and scraps of debris became the only shelter. Marines flattened themselves against sand and coral, while officers and NCOs tried to restore some order to formations that had been broken apart in the water. Communication began failing. Radios had been soaked, units had mixed together, timing was gone. What remained was initiative at the smallest level. Squad leaders, sergeants, junior officers, and individual Marines deciding that if they did not move forward, they would simply die where they lay. The first day at Tarawa was not a clean Marine assault from textbook diagrams. It was improvisation under massacre conditions. Men crawled. Small groups found gaps. Others blasted their way through strong points or skirted them when possible. Some sections of the beach became footholds, while others remained death zones. By the end of the day, thousands of Marines had gotten onto Batio. That fact alone was astonishing considering the approach they had endured, but the cost had been appalling. Tarawa had revealed its central truth. This would not be a battle won by one powerful bombardment or one wave of courage. It would be won, if at all, by surviving the impossible long enough to start dismantling the island's defenses from point-blank range. Once enough Marines reached Batio, the character of the battle changed. The hardest part of getting onto the island had passed for some units, but now came the equally brutal work of fighting inland. Tarawa was not won by one dramatic breakthrough. It was won by reducing one bunker, one trench line, one machine gun nest, one strong point at a time. This kind of combat was slow, close, and exhausting. Marines used grenades, satchel charges, flamethrowers, demolition teams, machine gun fire, and tank support wherever possible. Each strongpoint demanded its own solution. Some had to be isolated, others had to be blasted directly. Some were taken only after Marines got close enough to place charges by hand. The small size of Batio increased the intensity. There was no spacious rear area, no quiet flank, no easy place where the noise of battle disappeared. Smoke, heat, gunfire, concussion, and the smell of burned coral and explosives covered almost everything. American tanks supported the assault where terrain allowed, though they too were vulnerable in restricted space and under concentrated enemy fire. Engineers became critical. This was not simply infantry against infantry. It was a technical and physical contest against a prepared defensive system. As more men and heavier support reached the island, the balance began to shift. But stronger did not mean easy. Every advance still cost lives. Every gain had to be paid for. Marines who survived the lagoon often died fighting for the next bunker, and the Japanese defenders did not collapse simply because the beachhead had been secured. They fought from one prepared position after another with discipline and determination. Tarawa was a battle in which the defenders' resistance remained dangerous until the very end. On the second and third days, the American effort became more organized and more destructive. Where the first day had been defined by chaos and survival, the next phase was defined by pressure. More troops got ashore. More support weapons entered the fight. Better coordination began to emerge. The Americans were still under fire, still taking losses, but they were no longer trapped on the shoreline to the same degree. Now they were methodically reducing Batio. Marines advanced through wreckage and smoke, attacking bunkers from the sides and rear when possible. Tanks fired directly into strongpoints. Flamethrowers forced defenders out or burned them inside fortified positions. Demolition teams blew openings in pillboxes and sealed others permanently. Each hardpoint taken made the next one more isolated. Yet progress remained slow because the island was so heavily prepared and because the defenders kept fighting. Tarawa was not a battle in which the Japanese line simply broke and ran. It had to be crushed in sections. This gave the battle its grim rhythm. Advance a little, stop under fire, gather support, destroy a bunker, move again, repeat. By November 22nd, the island's organized defensive system was shrinking rapidly. The Japanese were losing ground, losing coherence, and losing the ability to dominate the entire battlefield. But they were still dangerous, and their remaining positions could still kill. The Americans understood by now that Tarawa was going to be won through annihilation, not through maneuver or intimidation. The defenders were not going to surrender the island because the situation was hopeless. They were going to hold until they were physically destroyed. And that meant the battle, though clearly shifting, still had one more violent act left in it. As Batio contracted under American pressure, the surviving Japanese defenders prepared for the kind of ending that had become characteristic in the Pacific, a final, desperate refusal to accept defeat quietly. That refusal came in the form of last stands and a final charge. The remaining Japanese strength on the island was fragmented, but not broken in will. They fought from blasted positions, from trenches, from wrecked defensive works, and from whatever cover remained. When organized resistance could no longer restore the situation, what remained was violence without expectation of survival. During the last night of the battle, the surviving defenders launched a final banzai attack. It was furious, it was desperate, it was doomed. The attack failed, but it showed once again what made Pacific Island warfare so costly. Even after a defender had been cut apart, shelled, bombed, and compressed into a tiny area, he could still inflict casualties in one last charge. By the morning of November 23rd, organized resistance on Batio was finished. The island was declared secure. The battle had lasted 76 hours. That sounds short when measured on paper. It does not sound short when measured in the experience of the men who endured it. For them, Tarawa was a blur of surf, coral, screaming engines, wet radios, exploding shells, bunker mouths, burned positions, and bodies lying in the lagoon or against the seawall. Almost the entire Japanese defense force on Baishio had been destroyed. Only a tiny number of Japanese survivors were taken prisoner, along with Korean laborers who had been forced into the island's construction and support work. Tarawa was over. But the meaning of the battle had only begun to spread. Tarawa was a victory, but it did not look or feel like a comfortable one. American casualties were too high and too concentrated. More than 1,000 Americans were killed in just 3 days. Roughly 2,000 more were wounded. In such a small space, over such a short time, those losses created a powerful shock. For Marines who fought there, the shock was immediate. For Americans at home, it grew as reports, photographs, and film footage emerged. Tarawa forced the American public to confront what Pacific amphibious warfare really meant. This was not an abstraction. It was not a set of arrows on a map. It was young men drowning under heavy packs, lying dead in surf, burned out of landing craft, and shot down while trying to reach islands many Americans had never heard of before the war. The battle also raised difficult questions. If so much blood had to be spent to seize one tiny island, what would happen at larger, stronger, more heavily defended objectives farther west? If Tarawa cost this much, what would the road to the Marshalls, Marianas, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa demand? This is one reason Tarawa became bigger than its physical scale. It compressed the future into one battle. It showed what invasion against Japan's island line would look like when geography, prepared defenses, and human determination all aligned against the attacker. Tarawa stripped away illusion. It revealed that victory in the Central Pacific would be possible, but not cheap, not tidy, and not merciful. That revelation mattered militarily. It also mattered psychologically. The United States had won, yes, but it had won in a way that made the price of future victories impossible to ignore. The importance of Tarawa lies not only in its capture, but in what it taught. American commanders studied the battle intensely because they had no choice. Too many things had gone wrong in ways that could not be ignored. The reef had been deadly. Tide estimates had been insufficient. Pre-landing bombardment had not lasted long enough or hit deeply enough to neutralize all the hardened defenses. Too many men had been left exposed between transport plan and shoreline. Radios and communication equipment had failed under surf conditions. Follow-on waves had not always reached the beach in the order or condition planners expected. These were not technical details in a staff report. They were direct causes of death. So Tarawa became a bloody classroom. Future assaults would put greater emphasis on hydrographic reconnaissance, on understanding tide conditions, on using more tracked amphibious vehicles, on better coordination between naval gunfire and landing waves, on waterproofing equipment, and on preparing to destroy deeply embedded defenses more thoroughly before the infantry went in. This is why Tarawa matters far beyond November 1943. It was not merely a tactical victory over one fortified atoll. It was an instructional battle that shaped the next stages of the war. The knowledge bought at Tarawa influenced later operations across the Central Pacific. In that sense, Tarawa changed the method of American invasion. It transformed amphibious war from a developing concept into a harshly corrected practice. So what did Tarawa change? It did not end the war. It did not destroy the Japanese fleet. It did not by itself guarantee the road to Japan. What it did was prove that the Central Pacific offensive could break into Japan's outer defenses, and prove exactly how costly that entry would be. Tarawa was not only a battlefield, it was the price of understanding. And from that understanding came the next steps west. It also changed the way Americans thought about the Pacific battlefield itself. Coral Islands were not going to be side notes. They were going to be brutal laboratories of firepower, logistics, engineering, and human endurance. Tarawa made that plain. For the Marines who fought there, The battle was remembered not because it lasted long, but because it compressed everything terrible about amphibious war into a handful of days. Exposure, confusion, courage, improvisation, and loss were all intensified by the scale of the island. That is why Tarawa still stands as one of the defining American battles of 1943. Not because it was the biggest, but because it forced a hard military education at the exact moment the United States needed one most. And unlike the more famous turning point battles of the war, Tarawa offered no comforting illusion of distance. It was seen up close, measured in yards, seconds, and individual acts of survival. That intimacy is part of why it endured in American memory.